This is a podcast showing the latest on the UK labour market for July 2011. For a transcript, email info@ons.gov.uk. We are going to look at the labour market estimates for the UK in March to May 2011, comparing them to December to February 2011. Firstly, unemployment in the UK for everyone aged 16 and over was 2.45 million, down 26,000 on the previous 3 months. Employment for everyone aged 16 and over stood at 29.28 million, up 50,000, while inactivity for those aged 16 to 64 was 9.33 million, up 32,000. Looking at June 2011, we can compare May 2011 for the claimant count, which is a count of everyone in the UK that are claiming benefits related to looking for work. Note that this is not the same as everyone unemployed, as some people who are unemployed do not claim benefits. The count stood at 1.52 million in June, up 24,500 from May. We will now look in a little more detail at each of the series going back to 2006. Firstly, here's the unemployment level with the recent recession shaded, and we can see that unemployment was pretty flat in the run-up to the recession, increasing in the recession, and it has hovered around 2.5 million since the end of the recession, with the latest estimate 2.45 million. Now, looking at the employment level, focusing the scale on the graph between 28 million and 30 million, here is the line and here the period of the recession. And unemployment in the UK was increasing in the run-up to the recession. It fell in the recession and was a little flat following the recession, but with it starting to increase in the first half of 2010. It then flattened out, but has been increasing since September to November 2010, with it now at 29.28 million, the highest level since November to January 2009. We will now look at inactivity, and we can see that it was increasing in the early part of the period we're considering here, driven mainly by an increase in students. It was then reasonably flat in the run-up to and the early part of the recession, before increasing in 2009, again with further increases in people studying. Inactivity has been reasonably constant in the recent quarters, and currently stands at 9.33 million. We can look underneath the headline numbers, and this month we will focus a little on employment, using an employment index which basically shows the percentage change in employment when comparing it to the level before the start of the recent recession. An index of 100 is shown here by the black line, so below this the level is below that at the start of the recession, and above it is higher. We can also break the graph up to show the recession period and the recovery. Here's the index for employment, and we can see that the employment index fell below 100 after the start of the recent recession, and continued to fall throughout the recession. It remained reasonably flat before beginning to rise in 2010. This trend has continued throughout the beginning of 2011, however employment remains below the level seen before the start of the recession. We can also see how employment differs for those working full-time and part-time, but note that most people in the UK tend to work full-time. Plotting both lines, we can see that the number of people working part-time increased through the recession, with an accelerated increase just before the end of the recession, before falling slightly, but with an increase in recent months. This means that over the recession and recovery, increases in part-time employment helped to hold up the fall in total employment. Now we will look at those in part-time employment in a little more detail by considering the percentage of those who would like a full-time job. Going back to 2006, we can see that in the period before the recent recession, the percentage of part-time workers who wanted a full-time job was fairly constant, at just below 10%. However, during the recession, as full-time employment opportunities fell, this employment increased quite steeply, and continues to increase, albeit at a slightly slower rate, and it currently stands at around 16.1%. Next, looking at the monthly claimant count figures, we can see that it was falling in the run-up to the recent recession. However, there was a sharp increase in the claimant count to over 1.5 million during the recession. It began to fall in 2010, however recent months have seen an increase, and the number of people claiming benefits related to looking for work stood at 1.52 million in June 2011. Finally, we will look at earnings growth in the public and private sector, comparing the annual change from one period to a year earlier. Plotting a line showing zero earnings growth and highlighting the recession period, we will first show earnings growth in the public sector, and that has been reasonably flat over the period, although declining from around early 2010, and it currently stands at 2.1%. There was a reclassification of some banks during this period, and if we exclude financial services from the public sector, we can see that earnings growth was initially lower since the recession. However, this has now flattened out and currently stands at 1.9%. Now looking at the private sector, we can see that before the recession, earnings growth was higher than in the public sector. However, earnings growth declined sharply after the start of the recession and stood at -4% in January to March 2009, mainly due to a fall in bonus payments. Earnings growth started to recover after the recession, with a peak when bonuses bounced back a year after the sharp decline, and it currently stands at 2.2%.